The morning started like any other in the small village of Millbrook. 8-year-old Tommy Henderson was playing in his backyard when he heard the strange crackling sound coming from his father's old radio in the shed. His father, a former military communications officer, had taught him how to use the emergency frequencies, but only for real emergencies. Tommy had never imagined he would need to use that knowledge. The radio had been acting up for weeks, randomly picking up different signals from around the region. Tommy's father had planned to fix it, but work at the factory kept him busy. That morning, however, the radio seemed to lock onto a frequency that made Tommy's blood run cold. Through the static, he could hear voices, adult voices discussing something that made his stomach twist with fear. They were talking about his little sister Emma, who had gone missing 3 days ago. The police had called off the active search, saying she had probably wandered into the woods and would turn up soon. But these voices were different. They knew exactly where Emma was. Tommy pressed his ear closer to the radio, his small hands trembling as he adjusted the frequency dial. The voices became clearer, and what he heard made him realize that Emma was in terrible danger. These men had taken her, and they were planning to move her somewhere far away that very afternoon. His parents had gone to the next town to put up more missing person flyers, leaving Tommy with his grandmother, who was napping upstairs. Tommy knew he had to act fast, but calling the local police seemed pointless. They had already given up on finding Emma quickly. Then he remembered something his father had told him about emergency frequencies that could reach the Royal Guard headquarters directly. Tommy's father had served with the Royal Guard years ago, before moving to this quiet village. He had shown Tommy the special frequency that could bypass local authorities in cases of extreme emergency. Only use this if lives are at stake, and there's no other way, his father had warned him. With shaking fingers, Tommy tuned the radio to the emergency frequency his father had shown him. He had never spoken on a radio before, but desperation gave him courage. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the transmission button and spoke into the microphone. "Hello, this is Tommy Henderson in Millbrook Village. My sister Emma is missing, and I know where the bad men are keeping her. They're going to move her today. Please, someone help us." The response came immediately, crisp and professional. "This is Royal Guard Central Command. State your emergency and location clearly." Tommy's words tumbled out in a rush as he explained everything he had overheard on the radio. He gave them the location the men had mentioned, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the next town. He told them about the voices discussing moving Emma that afternoon, and about how the local police had stopped actively searching. The voice on the other end asked several quick, precise questions. Tommy answered as best he could, his heart racing with hope and fear. Finally, the voice said, "Stay exactly where you are. Do not leave your location. We are dispatching units immediately." Tommy sat by the radio, clutching the microphone, praying that he had done the right thing. In his 8-year-old mind, he had just called the most important people he could think of, the elite Royal Guard who protected the royal family and handled the most serious emergencies in the kingdom. He hoped they would believe a child's desperate plea for help. Minutes felt like hours as Tommy waited, listening to the radio chatter and hoping that somewhere, people were racing to save his little sister before it was too late. At the Royal Guard headquarters, 50 miles away, Captain James Morrison was reviewing morning security reports when the emergency call came through. As the duty officer, he had handled hundreds of emergency calls over his 15-year career, but something about this one made him pause. The voice was young, clearly a child, but the information was disturbingly specific. Morrison quickly pulled up the case files for missing children in the region. There it was, Emma Henderson, age 6, missing for 3 days from Millbrook Village. The local police report indicated they suspected she had wandered off and gotten lost in the nearby woods. Standard procedure for such cases was to let local authorities handle the search unless specifically requested to assist. But this child, Tommy, was claiming knowledge of a kidnapping and providing specific location details. Morrison's training told him to verify the information through proper channels. But something in the boy's voice made him reach for his secure phone instead. "Get me Detective Sarah Chen with Millbrook Police," Morrison ordered his communications officer. Within minutes, he was speaking with the detective handling Emma's case. "Detective Chen, this is Captain Morrison with Royal Guard Central Command. We've received information about the Emma Henderson case. Can you update me on your current search status? Chen's voice was tired and frustrated. We've been searching the woods for 3 days. No signs of the girl. We think she might have fallen into one of the old mine shafts, but we haven't found anything yet. Why is the Royal Guard interested in a local missing child case? Morrison chose his words carefully. We've received intelligence suggesting this might not be a simple missing child case. Have you investigated any possibility of abduction? There was a long pause. We found no evidence of forced entry at the home. No witnesses reporting suspicious activity. The parents check out clean. They're devastated. What kind of intelligence are you talking about? Morrison made a decision that would later be questioned by his superiors. Detective, I'm dispatching a Royal Guard unit to your location immediately. I need you to prepare for a potential rescue operation at the old warehouse complex on Industrial Road. Captain, with all due respect, that warehouse has been abandoned for years. We checked it on day 1. It's locked up tight, no signs of recent activity. Check it again, Detective, and this time bring backup. After ending the call, Morrison stared at his phone for a long moment. He was about to commit significant Royal Guard resources based on a child's phone call. If he was wrong, it would be a career-ending mistake. But if he was right and did nothing, a little girl might disappear forever. He walked quickly to the operations room where Commander Elizabeth Hayes was coordinating training exercises. Hayes looked up as Morrison approached, immediately reading the tension in his expression. Commander, we have a potential child abduction situation. I need authorization to deploy a tactical team. Hayes listened as Morrison explained the situation, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. You're asking me to authorize a Royal Guard operation based on an unverified call from an 8-year-old boy? Yes, ma'am. The details he provided were too specific to ignore. And there's something else, the timing. He said they're planning to move the child this afternoon. If we wait for standard verification procedures, we could lose our only chance. Commander Hayes had risen through the ranks by making tough decisions quickly. She grabbed her tactical vest from behind her desk. I'm going with the team. If we're wrong about this, I want to be there to take responsibility. If we're right... She paused, thinking about her own daughter at home. If we're right, then that boy just saved his sister's life. Within 20 minutes, 2 Royal Guard tactical vehicles were racing toward Millbrook, their emergency lights cutting through the afternoon traffic. In the lead vehicle, Morrison reviewed the warehouse layout on his tablet while trying to ignore the voice in his head that kept asking what would happen if they found nothing but an empty building. The warehouse district looked exactly as Detective Chen had described, a collection of abandoned buildings slowly being reclaimed by weeds and rust. The Royal Guard tactical team arrived at the same time as the local police backup, creating an impressive show of force for what might turn out to be an empty building. Commander Hayes stepped out of the lead vehicle and immediately took charge of the scene. She had dealt with enough hostage situations to know that the next few minutes would be critical. If there really were kidnappers inside with Emma, they needed to move fast but carefully. Detective Chen, bring me up to speed on the building layout, Hayes commanded as she studied the warehouse through binoculars. Chen pulled out building plans from the city planning office. Single-story, mostly open floor plan, 3 entrances, main loading dock, side employee entrance, and emergency exit on the north wall. The building's been empty for 2 years since the textile company moved operations overseas. Sergeant Rodriguez, the tactical team leader, pointed to several windows on the upper level. I can see movement inside. Looks like at least 2 people, possibly more. Hayes felt her heart rate increase. Movement meant Tommy's call might be legitimate. She activated her radio and called back to headquarters. Central Command, this is Hayes. We have confirmed activity inside the target building, requesting additional units and medical support. The response was immediate. Additional units dispatched. Medical team en route. Estimated arrival 15 minutes, but Hayes knew they might not have 15 minutes. If the kidnappers suspected they had been discovered, they might panic and flee with Emma. She made another command decision. Rodriguez, I want silent approach to all 3 entrances. No one moves until I give the signal. We go in hard and fast, but we prioritize the child's safety above everything else. The tactical team moved with practiced precision, spreading out around the building like shadows. Through his scope, Sergeant Rodriguez could now see more clearly into the warehouse. In the far corner, he spotted what looked like a small figure sitting on the floor. Commander, I have visual on what appears to be a small child, northeast corner of the building. Appears to be restrained. Hayes felt her stomach clench. Tommy Henderson's desperate call was turning out to be terrifyingly accurate. She spoke into her radio, knowing that her next words would launch an operation that could save a life or end in tragedy. All units, we have confirmed child victim inside. Prepare for immediate breach on my command. Inside the warehouse, Emma Henderson sat tied to a metal chair, her small face streaked with tears. She had been crying on and off for 3 days, calling for her mommy and daddy and her big brother Tommy. The 2 men who had taken her barely spoke to her, except to tell her to be quiet when she cried too loudly. Emma didn't understand why these men had taken her from the playground near her house, or why they kept her in this scary, dark place. She was hungry and thirsty, and the ropes around her wrists hurt. All she wanted was to go home and play with her toys and have her mother read her a bedtime story. One of the men, Marcus, was pacing nervously by the windows. I don't like this, Carl. We should have moved her yesterday like we planned. This place feels exposed. Carl, the older of the 2, was counting money from a duffel bag. Relax, the buyer doesn't arrive until tonight. After that, she's not our problem anymore. Marcus peered out through a dirty window. There's a lot of police activity on the main road. More than usual. It's probably nothing. The local cops gave up looking for her. They think she's lost in the woods somewhere. But Marcus couldn't shake his growing anxiety. Something felt wrong, and his instincts had kept him out of prison for years. He walked over to where Emma was sitting and began untying her restraints. What are you doing? Carl asked. We're leaving. Now. I have a bad feeling about this place. Outside, Commander Hayes watched through her binoculars as one of the suspects began moving toward the child. She couldn't wait any longer. All units, go, go, go. The warehouse erupted in controlled chaos as Royal Guard tactical officers breached all 3 entrances simultaneously. Flashbang grenades lit up the interior as officers shouted commands and moved toward the suspects with military precision. Emma's frightened screams mixed with the shouts of the tactical team as they secured the building and moved to protect the little girl who had been missing for 3 days. In that moment, Tommy Henderson's brave decision to call for help was about to change everything. The tactical breach was over in less than 30 seconds. Marcus, caught in the act of moving Emma, immediately threw his hands up in surrender when 3 Royal Guard officers appeared around him with weapons drawn. Carl tried to run for the emergency exit but was tackled by Sergeant Rodriguez before he could reach the door. Suspect down. Building secure! Rodriguez called out as his team quickly swept the remaining areas of the warehouse. Commander Hayes rushed to where Emma was huddled on the floor, her small body shaking with fear and confusion. The little girl looked up at Hayes with wide, terrified eyes, not understanding that these new people were there to help her. It's okay, sweetheart, Hayes said softly, holstering her weapon and kneeling down to Emma's level. We're here to take you home to your mommy and daddy. You're safe now. Emma's lip quivered as she looked at this woman in uniform who was speaking so gently to her. I want my mommy, she whispered. I know you do, honey. We're going to take you to her right now. Can you tell me your name? Emma Henderson, the little girl said in a small voice. Hayes felt a surge of relief and anger, relief that they had found Emma alive and seemingly unharmed, and anger at the men who had put this innocent child through such trauma. She carefully helped Emma to her feet and wrapped her in her own jacket. Officer Martinez, call for the medical team immediately, Hayes ordered. I want Emma checked out completely before we transport her. Detective Chen approached with a grim expression. Commander, we found a cell phone with messages about tonight's delivery. There was definitely a buyer arranged. If you hadn't acted when you did, Hayes didn't need Chen to finish the sentence. They all understood that Emma had been hours away from disappearing forever into a trafficking network that would have been nearly impossible to trace. What about the suspects? Hayes asked as she watched the paramedics examine Emma. Marcus Webb and Carl Morrison. Both have extensive records for child trafficking and related charges. They're not talking yet, but with what we found here, they'll be going away for a very long time. As the paramedics confirmed that Emma was physically unharmed but needed psychological evaluation, Hayes walked outside to call headquarters. The afternoon sun felt warm on her face after the cold darkness of the warehouse. Central Command, this is Hayes. Operation successful. 1 child victim recovered alive, 2 suspects in custody. Child appears physically unharmed. Outstanding work, Commander. The media is already picking up the story. They want to know how we knew to check the warehouse. Hayes paused, thinking about Tommy Henderson's brave call that had started this entire rescue operation. Tell them we received a credible tip from a concerned citizen. That's all they need to know for now. But Hayes knew the real story was more remarkable than any media report could capture. An 8-year-old boy had listened to the right radio frequency at the right time, had the courage to call for help, and had provided information that led directly to his sister's rescue. In her 15 years with the Royal Guard, she had never seen anything quite like it. Back in Millbrook, Tommy was still sitting by the radio when he heard his parents' car pull into the driveway. He ran to the window and saw his mother crying, but these were different tears than the ones she had been shedding for 3 days. These were tears of joy. His father burst through the front door and scooped Tommy up in a huge hug. "Tommy, son, what you did today. You saved Emma's life. The Royal Guard just called. They found her because of you." Tommy felt his own tears starting as he realized that his desperate call for help had actually worked. His little sister was coming home, and the bad men who had taken her were never going to hurt another child. As the family prepared to rush to the hospital to reunite with Emma, Tommy looked back at the old radio in the shed. He had never imagined that his father's lessons about emergency frequencies would become the most important knowledge he would ever use. The reunion at Millbrook General Hospital was emotional beyond words. When Tommy and his parents arrived, Emma was sitting in a hospital bed, cleaned up and wearing fresh clothes, but still looking small and fragile after her 3-day ordeal. The moment she saw her family, she burst into tears and reached out for her mother. "Mommy, I knew you would find me," Emma cried as her mother gathered her into her arms. Tommy hung back for a moment, suddenly feeling shy about approaching his sister. What if she was different now? What if she didn't want to play with him anymore after what had happened to her? But Emma looked over her mother's shoulder and saw him standing there. "Tommy," she called out, extending one small arm toward her big brother. "The nice police lady told me you're the one who found me." Tommy rushed to the bedside and carefully hugged his sister, trying not to squeeze too hard. "I heard the bad men talking on Daddy's radio," he explained. "I had to call for help." Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the child psychologist who had been evaluating Emma, pulled the parents aside while the children talked quietly together. "Emma is remarkably resilient," Dr. Mitchell explained. "She's obviously traumatized, but she seems to understand that she's safe now. The fact that her brother was the one who rescued her has given her a sense of security that will help with her recovery." Tommy's father, David Henderson, shook his head in amazement. "I taught him about the emergency frequencies as a safety precaution. I never imagined he would actually need to use them." "Your son's knowledge and courage saved Emma's life," Dr. Mitchell said. "The Royal Guard told me that the kidnappers were planning to move her within hours. If Tommy hadn't acted when he did, we might never have found her." Meanwhile, at Royal Guard headquarters, the investigation into the trafficking ring was expanding rapidly. The cell phone found in the warehouse contained contacts and messages that revealed a network spanning multiple cities. Captain Morrison was coordinating with law enforcement agencies across the region to track down additional suspects. "Commander Hayes, we've identified at least 12 other missing children cases that might be connected to this network," Morrison reported. Webb and Morrison weren't just random kidnappers, they were part of something much bigger. Hayes looked at the case files spread across the conference table. Photos of missing children stared back at her, each representing a family going through the same nightmare the Hendersons had experienced. "Have either of the suspects started talking yet?" "Webb is asking for a plea deal in exchange for information about the network. Morrison is still refusing to cooperate. But with the evidence we found, he's looking at life in prison either way." Hayes picked up one of the missing child flyers, a 7-year-old boy from a town 200 miles away who had disappeared 6 months earlier. If this network is as large as we think, Tommy Henderson's phone call may have done more than save his sister. It may have broken up an entire criminal organization. Back at the hospital, the Henderson family was finally preparing to take Emma home. The little girl was clinging to her brother's hand, seeming to find comfort in his presence after her ordeal. "Tommy," Emma said as they walked toward their father's car, "will you teach me how to use the radio, in case bad things happen again?" Tommy looked up at his father, who nodded approvingly. "Sure, Emma, but hopefully nothing bad will happen again. The police caught all the bad men." As they drove home through the familiar streets of Millbrook, the family felt a mixture of relief, gratitude, and lingering trauma from the experience. The quiet village that had always seemed so safe now felt different somehow, but they also knew that they had each other, and that Tommy's quick thinking had brought them back together. That evening, as Emma slept peacefully in her own bed for the first time in 4 days, Tommy sat with his father in the shed looking at the old radio that had made all the difference. "Dad," Tommy asked quietly, "do you think other kids might need help someday? Should I keep listening to the radio?" David Henderson put his arm around his son's shoulders. "I think, Tommy, that you've done more than enough heroic things for one 8-year-old. But yes, it's always good to be ready to help people when they need it. Just remember, what you did today was very dangerous and it worked out because you were smart and brave. Not every situation will end this well." Tommy nodded seriously, understanding that his sister's rescue was both a miracle and a reminder of how dangerous the world could be. 3 weeks after Emma's rescue, the investigation into the trafficking network had expanded into one of the largest operations in Royal Guard history. Marcus Webb's cooperation had led to arrests in 7 different cities, and authorities had recovered 9 more missing children from various locations across the region. Commander Hayes found herself in the unusual position of briefing the royal family themselves about the case. The successful rescue had attracted national attention, and the royal family wanted to personally acknowledge the civilians and officers involved. "Your Majesty," Hayes explained to Queen Catherine, the entire operation began with a phone call from an 8-year-old boy who overheard the kidnappers discussing their plans on a radio frequency. "Without his courage to call for help and his specific information, we would never have found the victims in time." Queen Catherine leaned forward with interest. "I would very much like to meet this young man and his family. Their story is remarkable." The invitation to visit the royal palace arrived at the Henderson home on a Tuesday morning. Tommy was eating breakfast when his mother opened the official envelope with the royal seal. "Tommy," she said, her voice filled with amazement, "the Queen wants to meet you." Tommy looked up from his cereal bowl with confusion. "Why would the Queen want to meet me? I'm just a kid." His father laughed and ruffled Tommy's hair. "You're the kid who helped break up a criminal network and saved his sister's life. That's the kind of thing queens like to hear about." The visit to the palace was scheduled for the following Saturday. The entire Henderson family would attend, including Emma, who had been making steady progress in her recovery with the help of Dr. Mitchell and the support of her family. As the day approached, Tommy found himself more nervous about meeting the Queen than he had been about calling the Royal Guard. What did you say to royalty? What if he said something wrong? His grandmother, who had lived through several royal visits to their region over the years, helped him practice his manners and told him stories about meeting important people. "The most important thing," she advised, "is to be yourself, Tommy. The Queen already knows you're brave and smart. She just wants to thank you for what you did." On Saturday morning, the Henderson family dressed in their best clothes and drove to the capital city. The palace was more magnificent than anything Tommy had ever imagined. With its towering spires and perfectly manicured gardens, Commander Hayes met them at the entrance and escorted them through halls lined with portraits of kings and queens from centuries past. Tommy held Emma's hand tightly, both children wide-eyed at the splendor around them. "The Queen is very excited to meet you both," Hayes told them as they approached the throne room. "She's particularly interested in hearing about how you learned to use the radio, Tommy." When the massive doors opened and they entered the throne room, Tommy felt his knees go weak. Queen Catherine sat on a magnificent throne, wearing a simple but elegant dress and a warm smile that immediately made him feel less nervous. "Your Majesty," Commander Hayes announced, "may I present the Henderson family, David and Margaret Henderson, and their children Thomas and Emma." The Queen rose from her throne and walked down to greet them personally, something that surprised even Hayes with its informality. "Tommy," the Queen said, kneeling down to his level, "I've heard amazing things about your courage and quick thinking. You should be very proud of what you accomplished." Tommy managed to stammer out, "Thank you, Your Majesty. I just wanted to help Emma." Queen Catherine turned to Emma, who was hiding behind her mother's dress. "And Emma, I'm so glad you're safe and back with your family. You were very brave too." Emma peeked out and whispered, "Tommy saved me." The Queen smiled and looked back at Tommy. "Yes, he did. And in saving you, he helped save many other children too. The police have found 9 more children because of the information Tommy provided." Tommy's eyes widened. He hadn't known about the other children. Really? 9 more kids? Really, the Queen confirmed. Your one phone call helped break up a network of criminals who had been hurting children for years. That makes you a hero in my book. The formal ceremony that followed included the presentation of the Royal Medal for Civilian Courage to Tommy, the youngest person ever to receive the honor. There were photographers and reporters present to document the historic moment. But Tommy was most excited about the part where he got to show the Queen his father's radio equipment and explain how he had learned to use the emergency frequencies. Perhaps, the Queen suggested with a twinkle in her eye, we should make sure all children learn these important safety skills. Your father sounds like an excellent teacher. As the Henderson family prepared to leave the palace, Tommy looked back at the magnificent building where he had just met royalty and been called a hero. It still didn't feel quite real to him. He had just done what seemed right at the time. 6 months after Emma's rescue, life in the Henderson household had settled into a new normal. Emma was thriving in school and had made new friends, though she still preferred to stay close to Tommy when they played outside. The trauma of her kidnapping had faded into something manageable with the help of ongoing counseling and the unwavering support of her family. Tommy had become something of a local celebrity in Millbrook, though he tried his best to remain the same regular kid he had always been. His story had inspired the development of a new safety program in schools across the region, teaching children basic emergency communication skills. David Henderson found himself frequently invited to speak at schools and community centers about emergency preparedness. The old radio in his shed had been replaced with more modern equipment, and he had started teaching radio operation classes for both children and adults. The most important lesson from Tommy's experience, he would tell audiences, isn't about the technical aspects of radio communication. It's about trusting your instincts, being prepared for emergencies, and having the courage to act when someone needs help. Commander Hayes had been promoted to Director of Emergency Response Operations, partially based on her handling of the Henderson case. She kept in regular contact with the family and often cited Tommy's courage when training new Royal Guard officers about the importance of taking civilian reports seriously. The trafficking network that had been broken up through the investigation continued to yield results months later. Marcus Webb's cooperation had led to arrests in 12 countries, and 23 children had been recovered and returned to their families. Carl Morrison had been sentenced to life in prison without parole. Detective Chen, who had initially been skeptical of the Royal Guard's involvement in what seemed like a local missing child case, had become one of the strongest advocates for the new interagency cooperation protocols that resulted from the case. Tommy Henderson taught us all a lesson about keeping an open mind, she would say when asked about the case. Sometimes the most important information comes from the most unexpected sources. On the 1-year anniversary of Emma's rescue, the Henderson family received an unexpected visitor. Queen Catherine arrived in Millbrook with minimal fanfare, wanting to see how the children were doing and to visit the radio shed where the heroic phone call had originated. I wanted to see where it all began, the Queen explained, as she examined the radio equipment that had made the rescue possible. This humble little shed is where one brave boy's decision changed so many lives. Tommy, now 9 years old and more confident after a year of recognition and praise, showed the Queen how he had tuned the radio to the emergency frequency and demonstrated the proper procedure for making an emergency call. Have you ever had to use the radio for another emergency? The Queen asked. Tommy shook his head. No, Your Majesty, but I listen sometimes just in case. Dad says it's good to stay aware of what's happening around us. Emma, now 7 and much more outgoing than she had been immediately after her rescue, piped up from where she was playing with her dolls nearby. Tommy taught me how to use the radio too. He says I'm getting really good at it. The Queen smiled at the sight of the 2 siblings so clearly recovered from their trauma and closer than ever because of what they had endured together. Emma, do you remember much about the scary time when you were missing? Emma considered the question seriously, as she had learned to do in her counseling sessions. I remember being scared and wanting to come home, but I also remember that Tommy never stopped looking for me, even when the grown-ups did. That's what big brothers are supposed to do. Later that evening, after the Queen had departed and the media attention had died down, the Henderson family sat together in their living room. Tommy was helping Emma with her homework while their parents watched the evening news. which featured a story about another child who had been found safely after going missing, thanks in part to the new emergency communication protocols inspired by Tommy's case. "Dad," Tommy said, looking up from Emma's math problems, "do you think what I did was really that special? I mean, anyone could have made that phone call." David Henderson looked at his son thoughtfully. "Tommy, lots of people might have heard those voices on the radio, but not everyone would have understood what they meant. Not everyone would have remembered the emergency frequency, and not everyone would have had the courage to call for help. What made the difference wasn't the radio or the frequency, it was you." Tommy nodded, finally beginning to understand that his actions that day had been the result of preparation meeting opportunity, courage meeting crisis, and love overcoming fear. As the family prepared for bed that night, Emma ran to Tommy's room for their nightly ritual of saying goodnight. Ever since her rescue, she had needed to check that her big brother was safe and nearby before she could fall asleep. "Tommy," she whispered as he tucked her into her own bed, "I'm glad you're my brother. I'm glad you're my sister too. Emma, sweet dreams." Looking out his bedroom window later that night, Tommy could see the old shed where the radio equipment that had changed everything was housed. Tomorrow was a Saturday, and he planned to spend some time listening to the emergency frequencies, not because he expected to hear anything dramatic, but because his father had taught him that being prepared meant staying vigilant. In the distance, he could see the lights of the town where the warehouse had been. It had since been converted into a community center with programs for children who had experienced trauma. Emma attended art therapy classes there twice a week and had made friends with other children who understood what she had been through. Tommy Henderson fell asleep that night knowing that his split-second decision to call for help had not only brought his sister home safely but had created ripple effects of positive change that would protect other children for years to come. He was still just a regular 9-year-old boy who liked video games and soccer, but he was also something more, a reminder that heroes come in all sizes and that sometimes the smallest voices can make the biggest difference. The radio equipment in the shed stood ready for another emergency call, though everyone hoped it would never be needed again. But if it was, Tommy Henderson would be ready to answer.